Welcome to the podcast, Really Interesting Jews. I'm your host, Evan Schultz. Thank you so much for tuning into this most recent episode of the podcast. I keep re-recording this introduction. I'm having trouble these days, and I think probably many of you can understand why. This is certainly a tricky and trying time in our country, and as I believe in the importance of this podcast and the guests and the people that I'm bringing on, certainly what many of us are doing these days is clouded a bit by the events going on in our country. And I keep trying to think, how do I express myself, and what do I want to say that hasn't already been said? And really, I think all I can do is to say thank you to all of my teachers, my rabbis, all of the citizens of this country who have found a way to express their voice, however that is, through petitions, through calling our representatives, from taking to the streets, to leading Havdalah at JFK Airport. The one thing that has nourished me in these times is seeing so many leaders stand up, to see people holding signs with their real convictions, with the things that they really believe in. I keep thinking, this is the time. This is what I've sort of trained for. This is why I sat in Hebrew school class, and this is why I listened to some of the social justice greats in rabbinical school to talk about the times where they really had to speak their voices on the pulpit and where they took to the streets. And now it is our time to do that. So I encourage you, find your space in this world today to bring your voice to the conversation, however that is, through words, through action, through compassion to other human beings. I think that, most importantly, is what we need right now, to know our neighbors, to understand them, to be curious about one another, to show feeling, to show kindness to the people that we greet, the people that we interact with each day, and also the people that we don't know, the people who are right now sitting detained in airports, who are sitting scared and terrified about their fate being decided by a select few in our government these days. So I'll get off my soapbox now for a moment, but felt the need to use this space to encourage you to find your voice at this time. It is certainly something that is important. It's certainly something that we as Jews have been told to do. It is screamed to us by the prophets, by the writers of Deuteronomy and our Hebrew Bible. And so I sit today certainly carrying all of those things, and certainly in awe and of great thanks to the many models of justice who are now raising their voices throughout our country and really around the world. To shift to today's guest, I really love how this conversation went. I decided on a whim to email Lex Rofus and Dan Liebenson, who are the hosts of Judaism Unbound podcast. I thought, these guys now have about 50 episodes. They've interviewed some of the key people in the Jewish world. They too, I think like myself, are on sort of this curious adventure to understand, to think about where Judaism is going these days. And from the beginning, we've sort of been in conversation. I've really been paying attention to what they do. I listened to their podcasts, and I thought, why not give them a space to kind of reflect a little bit, where they don't have to sort of interview each other, but where I can sort of play that role and give them the forum to kind of talk about where they are in their podcast, how it began, where they see it going, and what they've learned in doing this over 50 episodes or so. So I had a great time with them. It's a little longer than my normal episode, and we actually could have kept going, but I think hopefully you'll find it worth it. Didn't edit it too much, just wanted to keep it sort of a raw conversation between the three of us as podcasters, as curious Jews who are trying to kind of answer some big questions in a patient way. So I'm going to take you now to my conversation with Judaism Unbound, Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofus. Welcome to the podcast. Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofus, I'm so excited to welcome you. I thought this would be a lot of fun to sort of join worlds here of fellow podcasters. You are the hosts of Judaism Unbound podcast, which I greatly enjoy listening to. And I think in many ways, the two of you have sort of set the tone in the Jewish world in terms of podcasting, in terms of meta questions that we're thinking about these days, in terms of thinking just in new directions for holidays and in many aspects of Jewish life. So I'm very excited to welcome you. I find the two of you very interesting people as I listen to you every Friday, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to the program.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So maybe you can begin. I know you've had a chance to talk a little bit about this on your podcast, but I'd love to just hear a little of your story, your background, how you came to meet one another, and then we'll sort of get to your work on Judaism Unbound.
The way that I usually think of my story is that I was a rabbi's son in Long Island. My dad was a conservative rabbi, and when I was 14, we made Aliyah to Israel, and then I went to an Orthodox school for high school. And the way that I tell that story is I didn't much enjoy any of those three experiences, being a rabbi's son, going to Israel when I was 14, and then going to an Orthodox school, that I didn't connect at the time with those experiences and didn't grow up with a positive view of my Judaism. The difference between me, I think, and the typical person who grows up that way is that in the process, I ended up with an extraordinary Jewish education. And so on the other end of it, I had this sense of possibility. I attribute a lot of it to reading the book Who Wrote the Bible when I was 17, because I had a sense that you could put together the same information in a different way. And I always thought of myself as kind of a non-believer or some kind of dissenter, but I had that as a sort of negative self-understanding. And reading Who Wrote the Bible gave me a way to think about it in a positive way, to say, hey, I don't like the way that this has been put together in the way that I've experienced it, but I can see that it could be put together in another way, and maybe even that way is more true than the way that I experienced and didn't like. So that's kind of how I understand myself, and in a way that's what I feel like, at least I'm trying to do through Judaism Unbound, and Lex can tell his story, but that I'm trying to make that avenue available for people who didn't have the Jewish education that I had, and so therefore don't necessarily see the opportunity and the potential for Judaism to be wired up in a different way and to be just as powerful, but differently powerful. So in many ways, I think that's my agenda in doing this, and it comes out of my story.
Yeah, so in some ways, actually, in most ways, I think my story is a little different. But what Dan and I share about our backstories is I also was very, quote unquote, affiliated growing up, but in sort of a different sense. I mean, we were members of a Reform synagogue, and I thought of myself as a Reform Jew, but really, but most of the other institutions that I was affiliated with and involved with, my summer camp, my youth group, etc., these were all pluralistic. And I think that was important because subconsciously, I didn't really think much of that at the time. But, I was shaped with the mindset that Judaism could be a lot of different things. And I've talked about this on our show, but I grew up in a household that was like hyper Jewish, but people use the phrase culturally Jewish. I always say that, like, really, really, we were like capital C, capital J, culturally Jewish. Like, we had all the Woody Allen jokes. We asked rhetorically, is it good for the Jews, as a joke. We watched Seinfeld all the time. We had all of those cultural Jewish things were part of both sides of my family. Very important. I have on one side of my family the classic Jewish story of the socialists out on the soapbox immigrating to the U.S. in the early 20th century that I thought was, an interesting thing, but then I later learned was like a very classic Jewish thing. On the other side, I have the extraordinarily highly achieving academics who wrote lots of things and just achieved a lot. And I saw all of this without naming it as related to Jewishness. What I didn't have was any sort of real connection in a deep way to like Jewish history or holidays. I mean, I did what we've talked about in our show is the big three, you know, Passover, Hanukkah, high holidays. I wouldn't have thought of Shavuot and Sukkot as the big three growing up at all, as much as they were in the Bible. And so I liked being Jewish. That's my story's in a sense different from Dan's because I really liked the feeling, the kinds of Jewishness and Judaism that I was experiencing. But you know, I got to college, and I think like a lot of people, I started thinking about all elements of my life in more complicated kinds of ways. And for me, Judaism was at the center of that questioning. I started as a math major and I switched to Judaic studies. And as that was happening, I like jumped into every possible Jewish thing I could. I was, you know, very involved with Hillel, and I joined what was at the time AE Pi and is now Beta Rho Pi, a Jewish fraternity that is now an independent fraternity at Brown. And I was doing all these things, and I liked what I was experiencing, but I started to experience some dissonance between what I thought could be the reality of the Jewish world and what I saw as the actual reality. And that dissonance sort of was small at first, but it kept growing. And then I heard about this guy, Dan Liebenson. I was involved with Hillel International. Dan at the time was a really awesome and well-respected Hillel director at UChicago. And I heard about some of the amazing things he had been able to achieve. And I sent a random email, actually. Like I literally out of the blue, I just sent an email to Dan, had never met him, and said, hey, it seems like you're doing cool things. I'm a senior in college. Like, do you have any openings? And his answer was, well, no, actually. But let's talk. And so I did something else. I worked at the Institute of Southern Jewish Life for a couple of years and loved it. And about 1 year into that 2-year fellowship, Dan and I reconnected. And the more we spoke, the more I realized, like, this guy's got some big, grand visions for what Judaism could be. And I'm on board with most of them, maybe not all of them, but I'm on board with enough of them that I would be incredibly excited to hop on board and sort of think big. And that's what we've been up to for the last while.
Hello, yeah, and your stories actually sparked a lot of questions for me thinking. I mean, I maybe first kind of talk a little bit of just about sort of the actual creation of Judaism Unbound. Listening to the two of you, actually, your partnership makes so much sense because, yeah, you grew up in these two different Jewish realms. Dan, sort of this like kind of intellectual tradition, Lex in the cultural realm. You loved your Judaism growing up. Dan at a challenging time. Lex, was more in college. The first thing you actually make me think is, you know, I think with a lot of my guests, and even myself too, it's like every Jew seems to have to go through some sort of like, you know, dark period or distancing from Judaism before you sort of come back to it. And then I guess that key point is how you come back, or if you come back. And you're actually, I think, creating for a lot of people with your podcast a space to sort of maybe come back for a lot of people. I don't know, but as you were both speaking, that sort of popped in my head as a key theme of actually people who are doing really interesting things. There had to be some sort of like period of distancing or dark period of Judaism, and you're like, it can be better, or there's a big question to ask here. So yeah, maybe talk a little bit just about kind of the creation of Judaism Unbound, how it came to be, why the sort of forum of a podcast to reach people and speak to people.
Yeah. So just before that, just to pick up on your last point, we had a conversation recently with Rabbi B'nai Lappi, who's one of our guests and mentors and teachers, and she was talking about essentially the experience of LGBT Jews and how they were excluded and created their own institutions. And one of the things that came up in the conversation was this question of like, is there a way to harness that kind of creativity in the Jewish world without the pain of exclusion or the pain of feeling not part of it? And, could we bring about a situation where there was less pain, but we still had the creativity? And Benet said she thought there probably wasn't, but there was enough pain, to go around, that there was always going to be pain, and I think that's really right. And I think that that is also what we've seen in a lot of our work and in ourselves. I think it's just that on the one hand, you want to try to avoid pain and distancing, and on the other hand, that's often where a lot of the great creativity comes from, and ultimately the effort to reconcile what caused the pain and, like I was saying earlier, the opportunity that you also see. And, I think that also raises a question of when we talk about measuring and what success looks like, that if we have a Jewish communal structure that's oriented towards never hoping that people never drift away, that perhaps that's not actually the best way. And, you think alternatively of the Amish and the idea of the Rumspringa, where they intentionally want people to leave the community for some period of time and then come back from choice. And I think there's really something to that. So on your question of how Judaism Unbound came to be, I mean, again, it's one of these questions that you kind of develop a story about. Who knows what the real truth is? But I think this is at least truthy in Stephen Colbert's formulation, that when Lex first started working here with me about a year plus ago, my idea was that we were going to write a book. And we started working on a book. Lex was kind of the researcher for the book and was doing all kinds of reading of all the literature that was out there that we thought was relevant to this basic kind of question about, a kind of different way of thinking about Jewish innovation. And there was a point that came where we felt like, or at least I felt like, we had the beginning of the book, the sort of historical story of Judaism up till this point, and the kind of framework of disruptive innovation as a way of thinking about a pathway of change. And then we kind of had the end of the book where we would sort of advocate for what needs to be done in order to bring about the kind of change that we thought would be good. Now, in retrospect, I realized we didn't really have the end of the book either. But we didn't have the middle of the book, I felt, which was kind of the story of today and where we are, what's going on, what is good, why even the good things aren't enough, et cetera. We just didn't quite have it. We didn't quite know how to describe the human needs that weren't being met in all this, or that could be met, or any of that stuff. And so we felt like we had to do a whole new round of research. And I really love podcasts and listen to a lot of podcasts. And somehow the idea came about, like, well, let's just do that research out in public, and we'll interview the people that we think will be important to this part of the book that we want to write, and that eventually we'll have that part of the book. And, the podcast, whatever, we didn't really expect that a lot of people were going to listen to it. And then pretty quickly after we started releasing the podcast, its listenership was growing and growing and growing. And, we kind of realized, wow, this is a thing in and of itself. And, now I still hope we are planning to write that book this year, but that it now fits in a very different way. And it's been really interesting, and I think we can talk about this later, to kind of follow the adjacent possible from the podcast and say, okay, now that we're running a podcast that's really working, what comes next after that? And ultimately, I think our vision is still very similar to what it was a year and a half ago about what we want to build one day, but the pathway has changed a lot. And Alex, do you want to supplement that story?
Yeah, I think that's about right. I mean, when we started the podcast, I think what you said first, which is that it's hard to really, we had no idea what it was going to lead to. We did want to do this research, and we had some basic frameworks that we laid out in our first 10 episodes. We, cutely had Genesis 2 episodes, Exodus 2 episodes, Leviticus, etc. And so our first 10 are sort of like what we stand for on one foot. Although I don't know if I could stand on one foot for the 8 hours or however long that 10 episodes is. But really, we talk about this on our podcast. We are big proponents of experimenting with new Jewish ideas and seeing what comes of it. And I think that our podcast actually is a real lived example of that. We didn't know exactly what it was going to lead to. We had some sense that we had ideas that people might want to talk about and engage with. But did we envision that people would be starting their own local podcast circles, like book clubs? No, I didn't. I think it's great that they have. Did we envision that we would sort of, because of the success of the podcast, be thinking about how digital Judaism exists in the world and how something like a podcast that has no geographic borders can reach thousands of people way easier than any physical institution can? I don't think we were thinking about that yet, but now as a result, we've started to really enter into other kinds of digital Judaism and realized that, anybody with a laptop in close proximity is actually like able to connect to thousands and thousands of hours of Jewish material if they want to. What does that mean for our world? What does that mean? They also have access to millions of humans. We're actually speaking via Skype right now. None of us is in the same place. We're in 3 different locales, 2 different time zones. And so we've been playing around with that as a result of how the podcast has really taken hold. So it's fun. And I think if we touch base again in a year, there may be some other thing that we're playing around with that we haven't even envisioned just yet, because we really do believe in the power of that process of experimentation.
Yeah, and the things I love about your podcast, I think most importantly, you have this big question, but you show patience, you show restraint. You're showing, I don't have to figure this out in X number of episodes, or a year from now we're going to kind of have this question answered. I think there's a lot of people are so impatient right now. We're saying, okay, Judaism has to change, so we just need to make these sort of big sweeping changes. We need a major revolution in what we're doing. And that's actually, in reality, that's not how change takes place. I mean, it's more how you're approaching it. We have this question. Every week we interview someone. We come with probing questions. We're curious. We're trying to learn. We're sort of chiseling away a little bit. And to show that kind of patience, it's actually a really good model for people to see that you're approaching it that way. And I think, like you said, Lex, just modeling for people having conversations with others is really helpful. I mean, the fact that you have groups of people who are sort of riffing off your podcast, sitting together face to face and talking about it, or virtually, is really important. I think all of us have probably learned from Larry Hoffman, and he's sort of been saying lately that Judaism is very much a conversation, and you're kind of enabling people to do that just by virtue of how you each week sit down with someone and engage them. And yeah, I think for both of us, the medium of the podcast, you don't know exactly where the conversation is going to go. And all of a sudden, 20 minutes in, 30 minutes in, you can have this realization of like, oh, okay, I didn't even know I was going to get here, but just by 2 people, and that's so much what Judaism is about, just 2 people or 3 people sitting down having conversation, something is going to come of it, or a new idea might brew from that conversation. So that's, when I listen to it, I really appreciate that approach that you bring to it. I wonder if you could you touched on this a little, but you have sort of expanded. You've sort of created this brand of Judaism Unbound. You have, movies you can watch on the holidays, playlists for the holiday. You did on the High Holy Days, sort of a take on the different Torah readings and Haftorah readings. How has that sort of fit in? How's that sort of been received by your audience?
Yeah, it's honestly, I think it's been my most rewarding part of this whole experience. I really think that we being sort of Jewish institutions loosely, I think we are aware of what the internet means. We're aware that the internet is a significant thing for Jewish meaning, Jewish community, Jewish purpose. But we sort of treat it as this sideline thing and segment it off because we're afraid of it. Because we see the internet as like a place where Jews have access to Judaism that isn't our synagogues, that isn't our JCCs, that isn't our, local institutions that we love and contribute to, and et cetera. So we're not quite investing in them. And so we wanted to, maybe I'll speak for me. I really wanted to think about, like, what would it mean for somebody anywhere? Part of this is I lived in Mississippi for 2 years, and I had a nice community, but didn't have access to all the things that I would expect in a New York or a Chicago. What would it mean if anybody, anywhere, could celebrate, like, Shavuot, a holiday we don't think of as particularly major these days, at least not most Orthodox Jews, not most non-Orthodox Jews. And so that was our first one. We did Shavuot Unbound, and that was largely because I just really wanted to play around with this. Shavuot's my favorite holiday. I think we totally advertise it wrong. I think if you told a 7-year-old, hey, you get to stay up all night or as late as you can, eat dairy products, cheesecake, maybe throw some ice cream in there, and learn something. I actually think that 7-year-olds want to learn something. Maybe I'm an optimist. I think they'd be so psyched. I think if that was our packaging, our marketing for Shavuot, and that would work for adults too, like stay up late, read something interesting, or learn with your friends about something interesting. Maybe it's Torah. That'd be cool. Maybe it's something else. I think that's actually a great holiday. And so I was like, how could we provide this for somebody that's living somewhere where there is no Shavuot experience? And that's what we sort of set about doing. We made all these tracks. We had, a track for if you wanted to spend 1 hour engaging with Judaism. And that was just, you could listen to one podcast or you could watch one interesting episode of a TV show. I think we had Transparent on there that is super Jewy if folks haven't watched it yet. We had longer tracks. We had 3-hour tracks where you could listen to, we had a Bim Bam track, this great digital home for videos about the Torah and about holidays, etc., where people could, for 3 hours, engage with these awesome videos with their families or by themselves. We had 6-hour tracks, and we even had a couple 12-hour tracks. I don't know if anybody did those fully, but why not offer them? You can in a digital world. So we were psyched about that, and it turned out that over 1,000 people accessed those pages on the 2 days of Shavuot. That was incredible to me. I didn't expect that. And many of them accessed it at 2:30, 3 in the morning. So that it appeared they actually were using it for this all-night kind of purpose. And Jan and I sort of sat down and we realized, if Shavuot is doing this, and it's a holiday that sort of flies under the radar, it might be true that other holidays it'll work too. And so High Holidays Unbound was our next one, and it sure enough sort of blew through the roof compared to Shavuot. I think it doubled our initial number of website visits. And then we just did Hanukkah Unbound, which was even bigger. And I think Hanukkah Unbound is the one I'm really proudest of. I think we were able to put the most time in. We had 8 different ways to light your menorah in creative ways. We had, a playlist, like you mentioned, for different songs from not necessarily, Hebrew songs or songs explicitly about Judaism, but songs that touch on light and winter and these kinds of themes. And on and on. We even imported the ritual of Ushpizin from Sukkot, of welcoming guests to the sukkah. We imported it to Hanukkah because we think that when you've got an 8-night holiday like Hanukkah and you gather as a family, you can also welcome guests metaphorically, just like you do on Sukkot. We played around with all these, and we're looking to continue that. We're planning a Passover Unbound to come up this year, and ideally, in a few years' time, we will have sort of the full cycle of calendars unbounded and with digital forms of observance for people that want to try that out.
Yeah, and I think that I think what's really interesting is that I have a pretty different perspective on it from what Lex just articulated. And I think what's great about it is that, and what we're trying to do in general is that we're trying to create this tool that can work on multiple levels, And so I think like Lex, for example, is most excited, or among other things, about the digital dimension of this, right? Can we observe the Jewish holidays in digital form? Because Lex is a digital native as a millennial. As a member of Gen X, that's not necessarily what I'm thinking is the most exciting to me. Although, but I'm thrilled that we are, working towards this platform that works for millennials that way. And for me, what's driving me and most exciting to me is the idea of empowering regular Jews to remix Judaism and to, in some way, put in their hands the ability to do that without having to be bounded by what traditionally we're told are the boundaries of how Jewish innovation happens. And so, for example, the playlists for me, I'm the one that does a lot of the playlist creation, and where I'm trying to be guided by is the idea that what would it look like if we created a playlist of music that echoes the themes of the religious liturgy of this holiday, but doesn't say God, none of it is in Hebrew or any other sort of quote Jewish language. Is there a way to do that really can connect people with the very essence of what Judaism has to offer without putting the barriers in their way that various sort of sacred cows that many of the more authoritative Jewish leaders think is necessary, otherwise it's not Jewish. And I don't know what the answer is necessarily, and I'm certainly not making the claim that our playlist accomplishes that. In my ideal world, our stuff inspires other people to say, oh, if you could make a alternative menorah through essentially a chemistry set that glows, which is one of the things that we did, I have a different idea that I think would be much more exciting and valuable. Like one of our podcast guests, we were talking about using glow sticks because, in a college dorm, you can't light fires. And she was like, well, that's too limited in your thinking. Like, we should be thinking about, instead of putting the menorah in our home, let's put it in our car, because that's where we actually, and then Lex was like, no, let's put it on the internet because that's really where we live, and that's the kind of environment that I would like to create over time. And so I feel like our websites and our digital stuff is really just a 1.0 of this, and we, on the one hand, I appreciate what you're saying about us building a brand and that we're building stuff that's already really good, and I hope that's the case. But from our perspective, we really just see this as the very beginning and something that hopefully over time can really become better and better itself, but even more importantly, sort of inspire a cottage industry of literally people in their cottages reinventing Judaism.
I think what doing successfully is people that come to Judaism with a space that they're familiar with. So songs that people might know or shows that people are watching. That's something they know. It's comfortable for them. That's sort of a step they'll take rather than going straight to a Hebrew prayer or jumping right into some complex Jewish learning. And I think for a lot of people, it sounds like that's a good entry point. You could say, okay, yeah, this is a song I'm familiar with. I get the themes of this song. This is something I understand, and that's a really good then entry point into some of the world of the Jewish knowledge of these holidays. I'm thinking, as you guys are the question now I'm thinking about is in terms of connecting digitally, what are we connecting people to? How far, how deep does it go? I actually was saying to my wife the other day, I wonder what would happen if, we created like a Shabbat service that was on Facebook Live that was like dedicated just to people like watching online. That wasn't, most like streaming now. You're watching somebody else pray, your camera in the back of the room of some synagogue. But what if there was like a service that was, a couple people in a living room, and you could chat with them and you could talk and you could interact, and you didn't know where the service was going to go. And they felt like that was for them. And then I thought, is this, are people connecting to one another through that? Is this, would that be a way for people to engage that they just couldn't, face to face or in a synagogue? There's been sort of these series of concerts right now, this Harmony and Unison concert. I don't know if you've seen those, but it's sort of been a Jewish singer like plays for an hour online, and people could type in and talk to them and ask for music. And I think people are feeling like, wow, I'm feeling connected. I can sit in my living room and have this unbelievable concert and experience. And is that enough? Is that sort of in the spirit of the Jewish project? Is that where we're headed? I don't know. I can't fully decide if that's where the trajectory of where our ancestors were hoping we go, wherever this project began. I don't know. I'm curious if I'm rambling a little bit, but just what you were saying were making me think. How far do we take this? What does a digital Judaism fully look like, and is that sort of enough to satisfy people's desire to connect and find meaning?
Well, that's where I would start by in two ways. One is historical, and then one is theoretical, and then I'm sure Lex has digital native stuff to jump in with. But from a historical standpoint, I just would encourage us all to imagine this conversation in the waning days of the Second Temple period, or after the Second Temple was destroyed, where these rabbi guys are coming up with this alternative approach to Judaism. They're saying, let's really emphasize the Torah. Let's really emphasize that music that the Levites were singing in the background. And, let's emphasize our wisdom tradition and a few other things. And then the priests are like, yeah, but I don't know, the sacrifices, without the sacrifices, I just don't know if people are really going to fully get the experience, and they would have been right. The experience of rabbinic Judaism in the early days was inferior, I think, to the experience of Second Temple Judaism. But the experience of rabbinic Judaism, let's say, 500 years ago, or whenever you might say was the glory days of rabbinic Judaism, was probably richer than what it was in that heyday of Second Temple Judaism, because in addition to having developed a really moving ceremony, it was weekly and not just 3 times a year. There were all these elements that had been added over time that actually made it better than Second Temple Judaism, but it took a while to get there. And if you had said in those early days, I'm not willing to go there because it is inferior at the present time, then we never would have gotten there, and probably Judaism would have just ended, because once the temple was destroyed, there would have been nothing else. So, and that tracks with the theory of disruptive innovation that is a major theme for our show and for our thinking, which is a business theory identified by Clayton Christensen at Harvard Business School that basically describes why that process of something inferior that starts outside of the existing system grows and grows and gets better and better over time, and ultimately becomes as good and maybe better than what you started with, but open and interesting to a much wider group of people for all sorts of reasons. And that's what we would suggest here. So I don't think that current experiences of Judaism over the internet, whether it's sitting and playing with our website or listening to this singer, I don't think that any of those are as good as the best available forms of Judaism that you might find in the best synagogue there is, or whatever it might be. But that best synagogue experience isn't going to connect with a huge number of people. So for them, it's actually better because they wouldn't have gotten the synagogue experience at all because it doesn't work for them for various reasons. And for the people who right now are getting this wonderful experience in that greatest synagogue that there is, yeah, they shouldn't jump to the new stuff right now. But in 100 years, and this is where what you were bringing up earlier about patience, and we might come back to that. I think patience is so important in all this, that if we believe that this other thing, in this case, internet-based, might get better and better over time with the introductions of new technologies like virtual reality and whatever, that might start to be able to give people some of those social experiences that are missing, or other things that you might identify as weaknesses today, that we should really be investing in those things and allowing them to flourish and to grow and grow and grow, and not put pressure on them to get too big too fast. I mean, I guess I'll say the patience point right now, because I think it's so important for people thinking about what success looks like today in Jewish innovation, is that I think that people are so desperate, they're so worried about the future of Judaism, that anything that has even a sniff of being good, they want it to go to scale quickly. They want it to be huge, and that's not the right move, in my opinion. I think we need to be investing in a lot of really small things, not pushing them to get too big, but pushing them to get better and better and better, and a little bit bigger over time. And eventually one of those, and we can't know right now which of those, one of them may well catch fire and become the thing that, people gravitate around, and that becomes some exciting new version of Judaism, or maybe some of them will merge together. We don't really know, but we know from other walks of life that there are these patterns of innovation and growth that come about, and that bring a paradigm shift about, and that actually ultimately make the thing. I use photography a lot as an example. Digital photography is now bigger than film photography ever was. It didn't start that way, and certainly the quality wasn't good. And if we can imagine something like that in all these other walks of life, why do we think Judaism is different? And that's something that I think is really important in thinking about this stuff. Let's not be thinking on a time horizon of a year or two. Let's be thinking about a time horizon of 100 years. And what would it look like if we could really start to put in motion some things that in 100 years might reach the level of quality and sophistication that would make them true, valuable alternatives to what we are familiar with today. And in the meantime, let's really nurture what we have today and make it work as well as it can for as many people as it can. And at the same time, let's bring about this whole new ecosystem that we know is going to take 100 years till it reaches its full flourishing.
Yeah. So mostly I want to say amen, brother. But what I also want to say, so in terms of the initial question of sort of, and I want to make sure I got it right, but sort of, is digital Judaism enough? Here's what I would say. Dan hinted at this when he talked about virtual reality and that. We think about the internet and the digital world and computers as something you do as an individual person. And I think that's true right now, mostly. Although even as I say that, I had a moment yesterday where I realized I've had probably 5 times as many meetings via Skype in the last year than I have had in person in the last year. That's partially because of the nature of our work. But, I think that there is a communal element that is already happening via video chat and other things, Facebook Live. But I want to just envision a world for a second where everybody is able to connect with basically anybody else on the planet who is connected to the internet. So that's already just about everyone, but will be hopefully everyone in not too long. I want to envision a world where you can feel as if you are in the same place as them, or at least you are sort of connected enough and you're able to simulate feelings of togetherness with that person in a way that we can't yet. And what would that mean for our experiences of Judaism? I think it would basically change everything. I think the entire idea of localized Jewish communities, I think they would still exist, but I don't know that they would be as central, because you could build the same with sort of your pick of humans anywhere on the planet. And once again, that's not a 5 years from now question. That's a longer question. I don't want to claim a certain number of years, 100, 200. But I think that the idea that the internet is primarily an individual kind of experience versus in-person being a communal experience, I think that's how we think about it. I think that's collapsing. Because, and also the good enough question, I can tell you, we already have access to your choice of probably 100 sermons on a Friday night through streaming services online. That you could go to your local synagogue and probably get a reasonable sermon. But if your goal is to get the best sermon and I bring this up because my dad actually did this on high holidays.
Wait, at Evan Synagogue, you get the best locally.
Yes. But if everybody could have access to Evan's sermon, which they could already, but like, would it be good enough to have whatever sermon you have locally, or would it perhaps be even better to have 5 of the best on the planet every week, if that's how somebody wanted to structure it? Now, you wouldn't have the experience of being in the room with that person. You couldn't make eye contact and possibly smile, and maybe if you make eye contact at the right moment, elicit some sort of nice comment or response if the speaker's good. I don't know, but like, is that actually worse? I don't know. I'm saying that as a real question because I've talked to my dad, who on high holidays experienced 6 great sermons on different time zones through streaming, and walked away and told me that was his most meaningful high holiday experience in years. And I think that has to, we can register that as disappointing that, the synagogue locally wasn't as good, or we can say, wow, that's cool. We have access to that now.
I want to respect your time. I feel like we could keep that. This is a great comment. You guys are so good. Clearly you bring immense thoughtfulness, intellect, background into what you do. And I think I'd love to hear, and certainly others, just, is there a Jewish text or teaching or poem that sort of guides you in your work and all these questions in the way that you see the world? I'd love to conclude with each of you sharing one of those.
Yeah, I'm jonesing to do this, so I'm going to jump in first. Sorry, Dan, if you wanted to. I'm going to answer. So I've got a teaching. I would argue it's a Jewish teaching. It is not from a Jewish text. It is not from a Jewish person, arguably. It is from a character on the television show House. It's from Lisa Cuddy, who happens to be played by a Jewish actress, Lisa Edelstein. And I'd mentioned as a side note that she has a Jewish Women's Archive page, and the first thing that mentions is that at age 16 she protested Donald Trump because she was a cheerleader for his New Jersey. I think it's interesting given our times that we live in. But so she says on an episode of House, pain happens when you care. And I've been thinking about that quote a lot lately, and I bring it up because we also spoke earlier on this episode about how pain can play actually an important role, how distancing from Judaism can be an important step towards growth. It's a riff maybe on no pain, no gain, but I have looked at that quote for many years since it first was on the show House as a really important principle when I am experiencing pain. Pain happens when you care. And, it's not from a Jewish text. It's a very unbound way to go that I would grab from a character on a TV show who, because the actress is Jewish, Jason Alexander once said that George Costanza was Jewish because he's Jewish. He said all the characters he plays are Jewish. We could talk more about that, but pain happens when you care.
Actually, that George Costanza being Jewish line connects to one of the things that I wanted to say. Actually, I'm going to take some liberty and say two, because one point that I kind of think about a lot is that when we think about Jewish learning or Jewish teachings, we tend to go to texts, as if all of Judaism is in texts. And it reminds me of that story. It's, that sort of well-known jokey story about I've heard of it, the wise man of Chelm, that one lost his wallet and is looking in a particular place, and somebody comes up to him and he says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm looking for my wallet. And he says, well, why, where did you lose it? And he says, oh, I lost it about a mile down the road. And they say, well, why are you looking over here? And they say, well, there's streetlights. And that kind of feels to me like the reason why in many cases we think of Jewish texts as the only source of Jewish learning is because that's where the light is. That's where we have the most clear, easy way to find it. And that makes, I actually have this novel that I'm kind of working on that one of the key points about it is a Jewish historical novel. One of the key points that's involved in it is that there was a group of Jews who really were against texts on a very principled reason, that that they thought that texts were fundamentally conservative and didn't allow the true flourishing of a culture because they kind of set things down, according to some particular agenda at a particular time, and kind of froze Judaism in a way that was ultimately not good for it. And that's my worry about text in general as a source of teaching. So there I'll go with two ways. One is that I always, we've talked a lot on our show about Bernie Sanders and his Judaism having been called into question during the Democratic primaries. Is he really, what kind of a Jew is he? And, I think about the teaching from Bernie Sanders, which in many ways has been one of the main teachings that's guided my life from a social justice standpoint, which says, that my family was killed in the Holocaust, is what Bernie Sanders says. My family was killed in the Holocaust. And from that, I learned, and he's said it in different ways, that politics is a serious business, or that, we have to make sure to care for the vulnerable because we were once vulnerable, et cetera. And that strikes me as a profound Jewish teaching, not only because you could tie it to the text of we were slaves in Egypt and therefore we should care for the orphans and the widows and the strangers, but just because on its very self, it's an example of how Jews think, which is that we suffered and therefore we have a responsibility to make sure that others don't suffer. And I don't think that has to come from a text. I think it's well enough that comes from the collective experience of the Jewish people over our history. So for me, that's something that's guided me before I ever heard of Bernie Sanders, and now I kind of attribute it to Bernie Sanders. But for me, that's very profound. But I will add one text because I've been thinking about it a lot too lately, which is the story of the scouts being sent into the Promised Land at the beginning of the Exodus. And I think that's an amazing text for all kinds of reasons. But lately, I've been thinking that the great sin of the spies, as it's called, was the great error, was not anything that the scouts did, but the error was in having sent them too soon. And that so often, back to what I was saying earlier about patience, that we are so eager to find the new Judaism, to find the new approach, and we're sort of sending these scouts to go scout it, go there, figure out what it is and come tell us, and then we'll go there. And if you do that prematurely, it's an undoable job. The scouts won't be able to define a vision. People will follow them in the wrong direction. They'll say we can't do it. And really the only way to do it in this time of upheaval and transition is to just not do that, and is to talk about it and to try to figure it out, but not to imagine that anybody is able to go up on a mountain or go forward from where we are and be able to see anything that we can't see. That's not the right way. So so that's really what's been on my mind lately.
Well, Lex and Dan, I want to thank you so much for your time today. I mean, for me personally, what a treat just to kind of sit and chat with you and think together. I think what you're doing with Judaism Unbound clearly is something so important for the Jewish world right now. You're thinking, you are treading waters. As you said, you are patient in your approach. You are two people to really pay attention to. Lex, I'm so glad that one day that you decided to randomly email Dan, look what it produced. And I'm so glad I kind of just one day thought, hey, I should email these two guys and have them on the podcast. I think just from my perspective, great conversation. So anyone out there listening, if there's someone out there who you've been admiring their work, give them an email. Look what you can perhaps produce. But thank you. The two of you really have a great interplay. And your backgrounds and your approaches complement to get one another so nicely. And my favorite people in the world are people who are really brilliant and menschy, and the two of you definitely fit that bill. So thank you for taking the time to come on this podcast and engage in conversation. I encourage everyone to check out your podcast, Judaism Unbound, and your website. I don't know if you want to say any last words or where people can find you, or a little teaser for what's to come. But I want to thank you so much for your time.
Well, thanks so much for having us. And Lex always does the outro, so he can do a good job of telling you how to get in touch with us.
Yeah, I guess I can do that. I'll just do it quicker. But so we've got our Facebook page, which is just Judaism Unbound. You can like us there. We've got our website, JudaismUnbound.com, with all sorts of fun resources. And we've got our email addresses, Dan@nextjewishfuture.org and Lex@nextjewishfuture.org. And the last thing I want to say, by the way, is that Evan, in speaking about us in Brilliant and Menschy, is being very kind, is also Brilliant and Menschy. And just from the get-go, we came onto the Jewish podcast scene at around the same time. I forget exactly how the timing worked. And I also forget which one of us messaged the other, but it's just really fun to know that for anyone out there who's curious, we're not competing with one another. Like Judaism Unbound, really interesting Jews, the Jewish podcasting landscape. I think we're trying our best to model what it looks like to be supportive of one another and really elevate all of our work. And I can say just with 100% certainty that Evan has been one of the key pieces in making sure that like all of these Jewish podcasts that are arising are connecting and thriving and support one another. So thank you, Evan, for being such a great role in that.
I agree 100%. I think we're all, engaging in this process of supporting one another, having phenomenal conversations, kind of seeing where things go. So I appreciate that. Thank you. It means a lot. And wishing you so much luck. And I will certainly promote all the things that you guys are doing. I think it's so important. And thank you. Wishing you a wonderful 2017.
You too.
You too. Thank you. Thanks so much for having us.
Lost for words.